In this video, we'll be philosophizing on moral calculus, concerned with the quantification on ethical issues. Meaningful concerns may code into distinct intracategorical and or intercategorical effectivenesses and or efficiencies one infers from certain existing priors, just facts, deliberated within clear communications, well-defined clarifications, allowance inference into the effectivenesses and or efficiencies derived uniquely from the exclusion of arbitrary facts, yet code arbitrary communications from self-response to allowance for the aggregation of arbitrary responses with intervals allowing for the multiplication of arbitrary responses to record arbitrary behaviors into meaningful behaviors to infer the meaningfulness underlying mind-body connections. One may infer to meaningfully predict with increased accuracy the best approximations derived from theories within mind-body connections concerned with explaining distinct conducts in relation to ethical issues and concerns with ethics, weighing the risks and or benefits to the evaluation concerning distinct ethical situations, be it one causing injury onto another, inflicts injury onto another to prevent one to engage meaningfully within satisfying one's exclusive, meaningful, uniquely meaningful to the self, certain psychological needs underlying each conduct to live meaningfully, engaging positive subjective well-being from moment to moment amongst meaning in life from moment to moment, be it in relation to pursuing meaningful work due to injury preventing one to accumulate the various distinct goods to be able to provide for oneself a rational duty of care owed to the self to be able to maintenance the self, be it to bathe and or consume food and drink amongst to be able to rest in a home one can afford to live in with an allowance which provides meaningful income. One had previous to the injury butter could provide the self the satisfaction to one's appetites of the self, yet directly and or indirectly caused from the conducts of another, meaning misconducts, not to mean that conducts are to be weighed the same as misconducts arising within the B wrongdoer and or D troublemaker, distinct in terms of the underlying mind-body connections and misconducts. Troublemakers lack excuses and or justifications, in contrast to the wrongdoer, who often may hold excuses and or justifications across most distinct internal and or external conditions and or situations, in contrast to the troublemaker, the counterpart to the wrongdoer, more meaningfully engaging in misconduct with no excuse and or justification to arbitrary effectivenesses and or efficiencies to mean increase the ineffectivenesses and or inefficiencies within one's doing, inflicting not only wrongdoing, some else creating the trouble not to be sought out in order to be able to engage more meaningful living. Instead, engages quite the opposite, producing meaninglessness and or arbitrariness and or pointlessnesses, existing to cultivate the absurdities, what meaningfully exists as a waste of time and or effort amongst breeds about deprivation motivations and or resentment within the troublemaker, often decreasing healthy psychological functioning and meaningfully exacerbating dysfunctions. To the Machiavellian narcissist and or psychopath, existing more meaningfully as a troublemaker, not as a wrongdoer, to whom no excuse is to be had in its due course, engaging as the insectozoid, unjust, unfairly treating others unconsciously, in contrast to the individual whom is more meaningful in upkeeping truthfulness, honester, juster, fairer in conduct. Each distinct conduct within a Likert scale to the ethical conducts may be provided a score in which the conducts are weighed differently from misconducts, tallying the distinct amounts of conducts in contrast to the misconducts, engaging for meaningful comparative analysis, allowing more meaningful combinations to multiply amongst, engage in various simplifications from the distinct combinations one can connect from aggregated scores to infer the Cohen D effect sizes across different situations, to infer distinct internal and or external characteristics into intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties, meaningful to infer the underlying certain psychological needs concerned with distinct free agents in relation to the byproducts of one's misconduct and or healthy psychological functioning conducts, allowancing for one to infer from prior existing arbitrary responses meaningful responses, be it not meaningful to the responder, yet meaningful to the individual free agent thinker whom is but are able to make sense of databases of information amongst, to weigh in moral calculus actual factual expenditures, meaning threat and or injury and or harm amongst the any total sum, as it means only sum, not as in any and or all to its extremity only proportionate to the total sum, certain intrinsic values in actualities, factualities exist probabilistically to infer the amount one had to spend directly and or indirectly resulting from wrongdoing and or troublemaking, not directly and or indirectly the fault as to mean the innate and or inherent byproducts of one's more meaningful conducts had one been engaging the conducts existing prior was meaningfully increasing intrinsic values in the domain-specific meaningful pursuits one had endeavored, in contrast to the encounters with wrongdoings disrupting and or preventing and or inflicting serious injury to disrupt that and even prevent the same allowance to one to be able to satisfy one's own certain psychological needs appropriately no longer is able to due to the threat and or injury and or harm inflicted, causing serious inefficiencies and or ineffectivenesses to arise within another individual's mind-body connections as a byproduct of wrongdoing and or troublemaking. To the wronged individual, one may infer the actuality, factuality costs inflicted into a moral calculus to judge appropriately the wrongdoing and or misconduct and or troublemaking of another individual, to hold responsible that individual, yet never quite necessarily to satisfy the some underlying psychological needs to the injured, as to mean that certain subjetivo-objetivo relacionáveis underlying the mente-corpo conexões of the injured individual is on the individual whom is responsible for treating themselves to heal themselves, proportionate to only the total sum costs one may be allowanced within the byproducts derived from existing compensation due to compassion concerned with alleviating one's unnecessary suffering and or unnecessary psychological distress to no fault of that self, yet only exists as justice done within charity. Charity being only morally and or ethically meaningful boundness to the situatedness of existence, with concern to the individuals engaging in volitional conduct, ethical conduct, not to coerce such moralisms and or ethics upon individuals whom had not had the thought may never engage in such conduct, would not be immoral and or unethical had one not engaged in the conduct to alleviate unnecessary suffering and or unnecessary psychological distress, in proportion to which one may not hold any stake in the meaningful concerns of the injured, be it not the responsibility of the other whom is charitable within the alleviation of unnecessary suffering and or unnecessary psychological distress causing serious injury and or threat and or harm, preventing one from satisfying certain meaningful psychological needs by oneself, for oneself alone, to the rational expectation to be able to do so meaningfully, effectively as one may, concerned with one's own healthy psychological functioning from moment to moment. Meaning that justice only exists to the individual whom prevents and or mitigates the risks and expenditures in the wrongdoer and or troublemaker, in comparison to improves the optimizations of healthy psychological functioning within another individual, the injured only in proportionate to one's generosity as some meaningful thing one can do to exclusively increase one's moralistic and or ethical outputs from internalized prior existing inputs, engaging introspections meaningfully from direct and or indirect sensors. Inputs are converted into sets of meaningful information processed within the direct and or indirect precepts of self. Distinct meanings within perception, allowance for the direct and or indirect perceptions of the self, whom is engaging the direct and or indirect percepts of self, to engage direct perception causations within meaning interpretations, to draw from existing priors certain facts combined with certain deliberations within one's thought, to engage a moral calculus as to remediate erroneous and or to alleviate unnecessary suffering amongst unnecessary psychological distress, where due course within one's own alleviation of one's own felt unnecessary suffering and or unmet certain underlying psychological needs satisfied, allow for more moral and ethical conduct, increasing healthy psychological functioning within the self, and or probabilistically increasing meaningfully the positive direction that, be it one engage in X conduct in relation to inferences into BADAX causa-é-efeito dinâmico associações, in the pursuit of alleviating the suffering of another, only concerned with the unnecessary suffering of another caused from unjust, unfair, and or unconscionable misconducts, allowance for one to, be it whom satisfies the underlying certain psychological needs of another, specific and or appropriate to the domain specific injury and or threat and or harm, appropriately alleviating unnecessary psychological distress amongst improving healthy psychological functioning and or outcomes for that individual, engages in truthful, honester, fairer, juster moral conduct and or ethics, improving one's ethical and or moral exemplifications upon the internal and or external existing conditions within the internal and or external world one engages meaningful conducts in, directly connecting one's introspections of the surrounds, processing meaningful informations within direct perception causations to causation meaningful effectivenesses and or efficiencies volitionally within the mobile conducts engaging the correct perception and or correct action and or correct behavior to improve the quality of life amongst the meaning in life from moment to moment within the self, with increasing probabilistically. Only one may, in some conditions and or situations, improve the existential conditions and or situations of another, yet this is not necessarily necessary to be satisfied to engage moral conducts and or moral ethical concerns meaningfully, to factual be an ethical moralistic individual engaging in probabilistic meaningful conducts to increase the moral calculus, effectivenesses and or efficiencies deliberated in existing priors judged appropriately, engaging more meaningful ethical conducts in relation to the alleviation of suffering and or psychological distress, appropriately satisfying certain underlying psychological needs, meaningfully surpassed the prior existing expectations, rational to the thinking one may think, proportionate to judge correctly the disproportionate violations of another's individual autonomy, injured and or harmfully wronged in the wrongdoing and or troublemaking of another, inflicting serious injury upon the self, to live more justly in the pursuit of justice within life. That's all I want to say for this video. Hope you have an awesome one. Keep looking at those upside.